Hello and welcome to another episode of Still Processing, a 76ers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Chiavelli, here as always with my main guys, Sandy Giovanni, Justin Crosby. Sam, we'll start with you. How you doing today, man?
Doing good, man. I'm excited to be back for another episode. Off season is underway here in Philly with the playoffs going on elsewhere, but a lot of interesting stuff. Plenty of discussions about some high profile and less high profile guys starting up. And as Daryl Morey said at his presser, there's going to be a lot of changes this off season. So excited to see what those are, even if they're a little bit away. But I'm excited to chop it up with you guys again.
Yeah, for sure. First pod since that post season presser. And there are a lot of meat that we wanted to talk about there, but there's still a lot more meat this offseason that we're going to hit up. But yeah, just like you said, one of those things he talked about is wanting that continuity that Joel Embiid kind of pined after that last postseason game, but not going to have it this season. Hopefully going forward. But Justin, how are you feeling heading into this offseason?
Feeling good. I'm not as doom and gloom as most people are. So feel like off season, blank canvas for the first time for Daryl. Surrounded by two stars. So, I'm interested to see how it plays out and what plans are made and who the Sixers truly go after. As you know, there's names connected to the Sixers already, and I'm a firm believer in where there's smoke, there's fire. But we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is we mentioned there's no what it comes down to is there's no excuse for Daryl Morey at this point. He's not bogged down to not having draft capital, which has been an issue in the past. He's not tied to an albatross of a contract such as Al Horford or Tobias Harris. There's none of that. There's plenty of picks up to technically 5 that can be moved as early as this offseason. You're talking about around $60 to $65 million in cap space, and you're looking to be one of the premier movers and shakers in free agency, second only to the Detroit Pistons. But you are a much more marketable team, both in terms of contention status and also just location, which it's Philadelphia's not always been the top of the location charts for free agency, but comparatively it's looking pretty good. So we're going to get into some of those different stars that we talked about. Again, there's going to be a lot of content like this throughout the offseason. There's a lot of names, as Justin said, the Sixers are connected to. First and foremost, probably maybe not the biggest name technically, but the most often associated with the Philadelphia 76ers is definitely LA Clippers wing Paul George. So Paul George has a player option this offseason, almost certainly going to decline that option, whether he re-signs in LA, whether he goes elsewhere. And there are suitors, not even just Philadelphia, but other suitors as well. The big question in Philadelphia, and it's shocking that we've reached this point of the conversation. It's not just, do you think the Sixers will be able to get Paul George? But now you're having people who are having the conversation, well, do we want Paul George? Is this the guy that the Sixers should even target? And that's kind of I would say, it's a sense of realism and a sense of fear, because you don't have unlimited shots anymore. Like the tail end of the process is in sight, obviously. And a lot of people arguing the process is technically already over. But when you're talking about Joel, like he's just not going to be around forever. And so this is, I don't want to say the last chance, but it's damn near close. So the Sixers have to get it right. So Sam, I'll turn to you first. Should the Sixers even sign Paul George?
I mean, it really is tough because, obviously the goal right now is to, be as competitive as you can for the remainder of Joel's prime. But what's really tough about getting a guy older than him is that it spills into Maxi's prime. So, you mentioned the contracts that the Sixers don't have to worry about anymore. And Paul George is obviously a very good player, and I'll get into that shortly. But just like, if you get another bad contract that makes it harder to build around Maxey, I think that will, be looked back on as a huge mistake. And that, although Paul George is a very solid player, he seems to be on the decline. I mean, he's 34 years old right now. He's obviously a great shooter. He has that star pedigree, but the question of signing him to a max is like pretty complicated. I think that although he would, he'll have it, pretty easy playing off of Maxey and Embiid, he's still a guy that is very reliant on his jumper, shoots a lot of mid-range shots, and it's not like he is posting up, I don't think, as much as Joel is into those mid-range shots, but like just the fact that he's shooting in a similar location, although he does provide a great option to stretch the floor from three, and another, guy who at least has a history of being a really good defender. I think there's a lot of concern as to what version of Paul George you're going to get and how he's not only how he's going to age, but how much money you're going to allocate to signing him. So I do think that, it really kind of depends on what the options are out there. But I personally have a lot of like questions about Paul George, and the answers to those might be they could maybe easily talk me out of not pursuing Paul George if the price is that, max contract for a lot of years.
Yeah, I mean, so you talk about the money, and it's not just that; it's how many years, like you just said. The kind of, I guess, ideal situation is a 3-year deal. Paul George is going to be looking for 4 more than likely, and again, he outside of Tyrese Maxey, who we know come hell or high water will be a Philadelphia 76er next season, and I think every other team is realized to that fact as well. You're looking at Paul George as the top free agent in the NBA. So, Justin, along that line, is there one concern more than any other that kind of hinders you from necessarily wanting to sign for Paul George, or are you kind of all in on that move?
I'm in on the move. Simply put, that this free agent class, outside of Paul George and other possible opt-outs and stuff like that, there's not really a lot of players that can. There are some players that can help the Sixers, but not necessarily be able to carry the load in a playoff game outside of Embiid and Maxey. So I'm in on Paul George, but what does concern me is I've actually had jokes with my friends about this is as far as the injury history of Paul George, and we already have one player on the Sixers who has an extensive injury history, right? So we saw what happened when Joel Embiid was out the lineup, and you just can't have another player who's possibly out of the lineup. Now, this year has probably been the healthiest he's been in the last couple of years. And he played in the playoffs this year and things of that nature. But the injury history does give you a pause because, I've said before, I told my friends, Paul George has to decide which person with a bad knee he wants to play with going forward and which combo guard does he want to play with going forward, right? Because he has both on either side of the coin. But what do you feel comfortable with? But it's you can't. It's hard for somebody who has not even a problem area, right? Embiid's problem area has more than likely been his knee or a random face injury, just random. But Paul George has been his knees, his shoulders, his back, his foot. It's been everything. So it's just kind of hard to pinpoint, where the medical staff could focus on and try to keep him healthy. But you never know. Maybe he comes here and he doesn't get injured at all, or he just regular load management. But that is a cause of concern of mine, is the injury history.
Yeah, no, I would say for sure that makes sense. And, you look at the archetype, and Daryl even talked about this at the post-game press or the postseason press conference. Paul George is a perfect fit for the archetype, right? If you're looking for a wing with size who's able to rebound, who has solid vision and maybe not ball handling capability, but passing capability. And again, that 3-and-D wing that can kind of stretch the floor. He can really play the 2 through 4 positions too. That versatility as well is definitely value added. But what does that mean if he's injured? That's kind of the conundrum, as you said, they're already in with Joel Embiid. And I like the duality that you mentioned of the situation in LA versus in Philly. In Philly, he'd be coming to a bit of a younger situation, but it's still pretty similar in the sense that you're working with injured or frequently injured player who is in that superstar tier, and then you're also working with a star who is a combo guard, working on that Maxey James Harden comparison there. And you look at the situation in LA. He's from that area. He's talked about playing with Kawhi for years. They've had the past 5 years together. James Harden's been a welcome addition, all things considered, in LA, I would say. So it's a tough situation to see him leaving. But at the same time, how can you not say that the tandem of Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey is a more winning combo than James Harden and Kawhi Leonard? So, when you're looking at, which team would be better with Paul George on it, I think that's pretty clearly Philadelphia. So from his standpoint, despite making the change over to the East Coast, I could see it from a competitor standpoint. From the Sixers' point of view, you got to look at the guys who are available, and this is kind of the key area where I don't want to say that they're screwed. They're definitely not screwed. There's a lot of options, and that's a good thing. But you look at some of the guys around, and you are looking at older guys. You are looking at guys with lengthy injury histories. And if you're not looking at those guys, you're looking at guys who are going to cost premium draft capital. So no matter what move you go with, there's going to be some risk. The reason why I like the Paul George move, not necessarily more than any other possibility, but among those top possibilities, is because you're able to bring in a guy who is at least capable of playing at a high level, not just through the regular season, but through the playoffs. He's averaged 24 points per game over the past 5 playoffs that he's played in. But again, we're back to the injury point. But he's capable of performing in the playoffs. I don't want to hear about, pandemic Paul. Like there's pandemic Paul, there's been playoff Paul. Like there's been a lot of good to go with the bad for Paul George. He's been further in the playoffs than the Sixers have since 2001. So, let's focus on that. You're not going to get a finals MVP just because you want one. They're not just falling from the sky. So with that in mind, I think Paul George makes sense as a competitor. He makes sense as the type of player the Sixers need. Daryl Morey he kept it kind of simple, where he said that they're looking for a player who is not the same position as Maxey or Embiid, which that's a great start because the Sixers have not approached it that way in the past and screwed themselves that way. And then on top of that, they're looking for a guy who can perform in the playoffs. And you don't necessarily need him to be that alpha. Joel Embiid, when healthy, and I get that doesn't happen, when healthy has shown that he can be that alpha. When he's not healthy, like these past playoffs, he's shown that he can still, maybe not in the fourth quarter, but throughout most of that game, be that alpha, right? You're talking about the guy who he's still averaging the second most points per game in the playoffs, around 33 points per game. Second most in the entire playoffs. And I get that he had a first-round exit. Some of these other guys are still playing. That's still, like, Joel had a good playoffs. He finally broke through, and despite the injuries, despite the Bell's palsy, had a very successful, albeit not winning, but from a statistical standpoint, winning or successful effort in the playoffs. So with that being said, you have a guy like Maxey who can close in the fourth. You need a guy like Paul who can get those in between buckets. And so that's why I think Paul George is a quality fit. And again, above anything else, you keep that draft capital. That's the huge thing for me, is keeping that draft capital. Sam, is there anything I'm missing on there?
I will say that the fit you mentioned and the keeping of the draft capital are big points for me as well. And I think it's a great point to bring up, like the playoff history, because I think it bears repeating, or just kind of mentioning that, like, a lot of players don't have perfect playoff resumes. They have some ups and they have some downs. Paul George obviously has plenty of that, and so that's one of the things that Daryl mentioned, was a guy who can play in the playoffs. And I think Paul George will be able to. Obviously the health issues and all the concerns there are legit, but I think because he's such a great shooter, his game will age pretty well, especially having two guys in Maxey and Embiid who took steps as playmakers this past season under Nick Nurse and should potentially do so again, particularly Maxey, with just the aging curve he is of being kind of a young guard, learning more of how to be on the ball as much as he can and make plays for others. And having a guy like Paul George who can, create his own shot I think it's important to not just have the two stars the Sixers already have create every advantage and create every shot, make all the assists for the team. And although the contract for Paul George could age pretty bad, I think that if he's the last big time option, I think it would still benefit the Sixers, because obviously it's tough to win with a player that's overpaid on a big contract, but Paul George, I think his game fits in so well that there will be enough good in at least the next few years, and that he will be able to elevate them to a certain level. There are other better options that one will get into it in a moment, but I still think that even though there's a lot of skepticism to be had, that the Sixers will be a better team with Paul George. And I think that's the obviously important thing.
You just said there are better options. One we will get into in a moment, and knowing who we're talking about ahead, I don't know that they're a better option, but we'll come back to that. But the thing with Paul George, you talked about him fitting like a glove. That again goes to why he's going to be so widely sought out. So the Orlando Magic, I think, are a team that you can't really sleep on. There's been a lot of talk about them kind of going after Klay Thompson, and if they do, I don't think that's a direction the Sixers are going to go. So that would work fine and well for Philadelphia. But you can't count them out of the Paul George sweepstakes either. So the difference there is, I get it. It's Orlando. It's not Miami. Well, it's still Florida versus Philadelphia, and you're still talking about Florida's lack of state income tax, which is set to make a pretty sizable difference. I don't have those numbers on hand for what the tax difference is between there and between Philly. But I do know that between Philadelphia or Pennsylvania and California, Paul George would save an extra $19 million over the length of the deal. So if they sign, the Clippers can sign for, I want to say it's $8.9 million more. If it's not, it's $9.8 million more total life of that 4-year contract than any other team. Even if the Clippers sign him to that max 4-year deal that they can sign for even higher than Philadelphia, if Philadelphia signs to their max, it's a net difference of about $11 million that Philadelphia can technically pay him more that George will not have to pay in tax. So that's a benefit for Philadelphia, but now you factor in Orlando, which again, you're not paying that state income tax, and that difference is even greater. So all that just to say, don't sleep on Orlando. But since we're talking about Orlando, let's talk about the guy with the Mickey Mouse Orlando ring. Let's move on to the next target, and that's LeBron James.
What a segue. Wow.
So LeBron James, listen, I will never believe that LeBron is coming to Philadelphia. We have been there. We have done that. We've had that conversation. I don't see it happening. You could draft his kid. You could draft all his kids. I don't know that. I just don't think that he's coming to Philadelphia. That being said, there is some big news on the Bronny front. He's been medically cleared to play in the NBA. That was a big hurdle to decide whether or not that he was going to stay in the draft pool. So he is staying in the draft pool. He's set to join, the draft and potentially be drafted somewhere. LeBron has said that he would love to play with his son, and effectively has said that he will go where his son is drafted. We'll see how that works out. I have my varying levels of faith, but before we get to, the big kahuna himself, let's talk about Bronny and the possibility of drafting him to get his dad. Justin, I know that you and I had a difference of opinion on this. What's your take on Bronny James as a prospect?
I mean, I just feel like Bronny James, there are certain guys in college, and not only specifically because who his dad is and access to all the clutch maneuvering behind the scenes to get him where he needs to be or get drafted, but there are guys in general who just are better fit for the pro game than they are the college game, right? So you look at guys like Cam Thomas is somebody who literally is a really good example of that. And I look at Bronny and I say, okay, he started off late. He had the heart issue. He really didn't play well. He didn't get a chance. He started late, didn't get to play well. The whole team in USC in general had a whole entire high hopes this year with their recruiting class, and they did nothing, right? So he was a product of that, of course. But I feel like Bronny has a chance to be a better pro player. Now, we're talking about his physicals. He's shorter than people thought he was. And outside of that, his three-point shooting wasn't as good in college than it was in high school. So we have to see what his shooting numbers are, and all his stuff comes from the combine. But I do believe he has a chance to be a pesky, on-ball defender on defense with an ability to create for others because that is his game. He has vision like his pops, and he'll have to be the guy to be able to eventually grow into knocking down those open threes when he's left open, when a superstar has the ball and he's in the corner or at the top of the key. He just needs to have the confidence to shoot that. I do believe he can develop into that because you see a bunch of guys who are unheralded that come into the league and make roles and names for themselves, right? Why can't he do the same? So that's my number one thing with Bronny James. I think as a prospect, I think he'll be just fine. I think as long as he has the opportunity to showcase some of his abilities, I think he'll be just fine. Like you think around guys all around the league, like Jose Alvarado made a name for himself. He niched out a role. There are guys like who made careers out of that stuff. Pat Bev, like I'm just naming guys in general. Not saying Bronny's going to be Pat Bev, but more so, if you can have a niche in the league, you can stick around for a very, very long time. And he doesn't have to live up to his father's name and be a generational superstar. Just have a long career, make some money, and knock down some open threes.
Okay, so I'm going to completely disagree, and then I'm going to completely overwrite my disagreement and end up agreeing with you at the end with one particular player comparison that he can follow. First and foremost, Jose Alvarado, Pat Bev. Those guys are special freaks. Like that attitude that you have, that's a way of life. That's something not everybody can have. I have a hard time, not that he cannot, I have a hard time seeing a guy from Bronny James' background having that same mentality, right? So not that he can't, it's just that it's not as common, right? You don't usually see that in with the sons of NBA kids. So when you look at his measurements, it's not great. It's not terrible though, right? There's guys that do have success in similar combination height wingspan. So we're looking at about 6'1" to 6'2" roughly, without shoes. We're looking at 6'7" and a half, 6'8" in the wingspan, right? I think it was officially like 6'1" and 3/4 and 6'7" and 3/4 in wingspan, whatever the case is. But that's the ballpark, right? So we're talking about guys like, Campaign has that wingspan, but he's a little bit taller. Tyrese Maxey's honestly about that height, but he's a monster shooter. Like that's the thing that Bronny would have to really develop to get to that level. There's not a ton of guys who, unless they have that specific skill or mentality, the Patrick Beverleys, we talked about the Jose Alvarados. You look at a DeAnthony Melton, he has a longer wingspan, and he's, that's where he thrives, is that defensive monster. The one archetype of a player where I look at and I say, this guy has nearly this identical wingspan, this identical height, so these basic measurements, has that plus bounce, or at least used to, that Bronny has, because he did have, I think it was near a 40 vertical. And he has that pedigree of a Hall of Fame father in the NBA. The dude that Bronny James should aspire to become at that next level is Gary Payton II. And I know that his prime was very short, but Gary Payton was nice as a defender there for a minute, especially with the Golden State Warriors. If Bronny can figure out how to maintain that level of play and expand it over 8-ish years, then I think you're looking at a solid role player who's going to contribute. I think even kind of come out of listen, the guy's named LeBron James. Like, I don't think you're going to forget who his father is. But, at the same time, I think that he can kind of put that distance away in people's minds if he is able to carve out that role for himself. So there are extremely few archetypes for him to follow, or not even just archetypes, but examples for him to follow and be successful at the next level, especially considering that I'm not a believer in his jump shot. That being said, if he can follow that Gary Payton II model, and if he can, progress along that same kind of mold, that I do see a way that he can potentially be a role player going forward. That's not a guy I'm looking to draft very high, though. I'll be flat honest with you, just because of the likelihood of that being able to pay off or not. But Sam, what are your thoughts in general on Bronny James, and just kind of a general, would you draft him or would you not?
Well, I don't think he's a guy. A lot of people are making a big, stink about his college numbers, which were not good, but also just do not tell the whole story. He's still really young too. That's important to keep in mind in all this, is that, yeah, he, I think, obviously it's his life. He can make the decision he wants, and I'm sure he will be able to, at least put a good effort in making the NBA. But if I were in his shoes, I probably would have stayed another year at USC or tried to transfer. Just another year in college, I feel like, to kind of
Probably a transfer
get his
because
feet under
USC
him
just seemed like
more.
a bad situation overall.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I see what you're
enough.
saying.
But right, and I mean, look, he's still. It's just tough because he never got a fair chance to be evaluated as like purely a player. Obviously, all the stuff with LeBron was attached. I mean, like it's obvious why, but it's also kind of just tough for a young basketball player. So I think he's a guy that is worth, for the reasons you said, like taking a swing on in the draft, especially because again he's young, he's a really good athlete. Even if he's not as big as a lot of people thought, he can still impact the game with his athleticism. I like the comparison to the Mitten, I think is the nickname for Gary Payton II that they have as a playoff.
I love that. That's fantastic.
That is good. Yeah, I think it started before he got to the Warriors, but I'm sure it like got bigger when he got there. But yeah, I mean, for any team drafting Bronny, and the whole thing about LeBron is going to go wherever he goes. I think it's not like an ironclad thing. I don't think LeBron's going to be following him to Detroit or some other team like Washington or whatever. Like, I think it has to be a good team first and foremost. And I agree, it's very tough to see LeBron coming to the Sixers. But if the Sixers do roll the dice on Bronny, if I think it would be just based on him as a prospect, I think it would be a huge reach to go for him at 16. 41 is definitely more suitable, for him, just given the type of player he showed to be in college last year. So it's very interesting to see where he ends up. He's probably the most hyped, like late draft pick since like a Bull. Like I remember he was in the Zion draft, and like obviously they were the guys at the top, Zion, Ja, RJ, but everyone was so excited to see where Bull ended up. And Bronny's also got another guy kind of with him in Zach Edey. People really want to see where he ends up. I think that any team that makes the decision to just draft Bronny without like 100% certainty of drafting LeBron, I think it's going to go bad really, really quickly. But I'm excited to see, just what Bronny can do in these scrimmages. I haven't seen if he is or is not scrimmaging. I tried to see if the combine was televised, and I don't think it was, at least not today, which was the day we're recording, which was unfortunate. But yeah, long draft process ahead. And obviously the whole, whatever team picks him, there's going to be those rumblings, however unfounded they may be, of LeBron following him there.
Yeah, so Bronny is going to be a part of the scrimmage. So I agree. It would be very interesting to see his performance kind of in that more competitive environment. I'm definitely willing to admit USC was a terrible situation. I think that coming off of the heart scare obviously is a big problem. So like, can he develop into a role player again, that Gary Payton-esque player, like possibly, but it's not going to be an easy road, and he needs to understand that. And not that he doesn't already, and not that he doesn't already have an immense hardworking nature, but he's going to need to make sure that he does if he's going to succeed at the next level. Because as much as there's certain things working in his favor, and we will talk more about his father. There's things working against him that are able to be overcome, but again, it's just going to take a lot of hard work before you get there. So, and this is a guy that if you're talking about the Sixers drafting him, you're not talking about 16, you're talking about 41 or another second round pick if they somehow get one in this draft, either trading down or out of 16 or what have you, however they get it. So. But with that being said, the reason why a lot of teams are looking to draft Bronny, we already kind of touched on it, is because of the possibility of his dad coming over, LeBron James. LeBron James, second greatest basketball player in the history of the game, greatest basketball player in the history of the game. I think you're kind of kidding yourself if you put him below 2, even though he's not my number 1 on the list. But an immensely talented player. Impacted the game in so many ways, changed the game, right? Just one of the all-timers. LeBron James is also about to turn, is it 38? Or is he? No, I'm sorry. He's already 39. He will be 40 years old come midway through next season before the All-Star break. That being said, still averaged over 25 points per game last season. Still productive. Shot the ball, I think, better than ever in his career, at least from three. So there's a lot to like. At the same time, there's kind of negative aspects to it as well. You're getting a guy who's going to kind of halfway play through the regular season, but of course, it's the playoffs that really matter. You're getting a guy who kind of picks and chooses when he plays defensively. And again, you have to decide whether you can live with that because he's preserving himself effectively for those big moments. The drama that also just comes with having LeBron on your team, his potential desire to be involved with the front office decisions, all of that comes with it, that whole LeBron James experience. Is that something that you would want in Philadelphia? Justin, why don't we start with you?
I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. Like, of course, like, you take 1 year or 2 years of LeBron James. He still hasn't shown signs of slowing down. Like, as far as, I mean, clearly he's older and he's averaging less points and stuff like that. Some of his athletic ability is not there every single night, but he still can average 25, 7, and 7 easily in a season. And also it would allow him to really, like, right now, he's really the second option in LA. And he really can take a back seat, be a really good playmaker for this team who needs another ball handler, playmaker, person to make decisions. And LeBron could pick a third quarter or fourth quarter to take over and do what he needs to do. Now, I would take all of that, even with the headache of LeBron expectations, the media circus, the possibility that I would really be sitting in the balcony every game with LeBron and the Sixers. But I think that obviously it would have to be the perfect storm for him to even think about coming here, right? Like, didn't want to come to Philadelphia before. He would probably want to pull a JJ Redick and live in New York, right? Like, it'll just have to be the perfect storm for him to come here. But I would take the stuff that comes with LeBron, because more than likely this will probably one of the most talented teams he's been a part of as far as other stars and stuff. And a lot of people want to ring chase with LeBron because they feel like they want. So it could bring other types of things with it. So I would sign up for the next year or two. I know most people would disagree with that, but I'm trying to do whatever it takes for Joel Embiid to get a chip and submit his legacy. So,
well, let me start with something that people might see as a bold proclamation, and I don't consider it so, but people might consider it such. Joel Embiid, at the level he played last year, if he is at or around that level of play next year, right? Just the prime he's been over his past 3-4 years, right? Joel Embiid will be the best player that LeBron James had ever played with if LeBron does come here next year. I have no problem saying that. When LeBron got to Miami, Dwayne Wade was not fully himself. Chris Bosh was clearly not himself. Kyrie Irving was not quite yet himself. Kevin Love was really good, but Joel's already surpassed Kevin Love, right? So Joel will be the best player, in my opinion. Anthony Davis, out of here. Joel Embiid, right? That's a heck of a good reason to want to come to Philadelphia. If they draft his son, obviously that's a great reason to want to come to Philly as well. I agree he'd probably be more of a New York guy than a Philly guy. I don't really think that that's something to care about, though people will. I mean, that's going to be a WIP thing if he does come here for sure. But I do kind of look around at these other potential landing spots about where LeBron would want to go. And from a competitive nature standpoint.
I'm sorry to interrupt. But the poll question would be, is LeBron really committed to Philadelphia, living in New York? Yes or no? Call in.
Is LeBron demanding a trade by living in New York?
if we get is LeBron a Philly guy? Like, no, LeBron's not a Philly guy. LeBron will never be a Philly guy. You know, even if he signs here, he's going to go to Geno's his first day. It's going to be a whole thing, and the city's going to melt down. It doesn't matter. He's a hell of a player, right? So that's the one side there. The one concern I have is that, you know, will he actually choose to come to Philadelphia? And again, if they draft Bronny, that is a huge difference maker. But I want to bring up the Orlando Magic again, and we've seen the success that he's had in Orlando. You know, again, there's tax-free implications. There's the warmer weather. You know, the much closer adjacency to Miami. You know, all that stuff. Like, these are all reasons why Orlando would be a good fit for LeBron as well. But when you're getting to, you know, would Philadelphia lean into it and suffer through all of that comes with LeBron James on your team for the greatness of the player that he is? Justin, I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head. It's all about the years. Now, LeBron's not going to, you know, I don't know. Like, he's already playing a lot longer than I expected, especially at such a high level. Is LeBron going to be playing 4 more years? I honestly can't say. It doesn't seem like it. It seems impossible, but you never know with him. That being said, I don't think the contract expectation would be a 4-year deal like you're looking at with Paul George. And I think that means a lot. So again, you're looking at a situation where you're not giving up a lot of draft capital. Maybe you're giving up 41, you know, so a second round pick for LeBron James. Or maybe you even are doing 16. And if you're trading 16 for LeBron James, I think that's something that people would really consider and you know, consider well. So yeah, I think that LeBron is much more of a I don't think he's the best fit like Paul George. And Sam, this is where I differ with you from what we were talking about earlier. He's a bit more ball dominant, even though he does sag off at times as well. But then that's not necessarily great as well because he's a bit too deferring. Paul George kind of fits in that more catch and shoot role at times that we saw with James Harden this past season. So that's where I think, like, from a fit perspective, you're looking at a better player with Paul George. But just from a pure talent standpoint and from the way that they played in the playoffs, listen, LeBron James is still a top tier talent. So do I think that he will come to Philadelphia? No, I've resigned to the fact that I don't think he ever will come to Philadelphia. But would I take him in Philadelphia? Hell yes, I would absolutely take LeBron in Philadelphia. They're like, to thumb your nose at a talent like that, where you're not giving up a lot of draft capital to get him, if really any. I think it's a no-brainer. But Sam, I got to get your opinion. LeBron James, total circus of it. How do you feel about that coming to Philadelphia?
I think he would be a great fit here for, even as he starts to decline, like the mental side of the game doesn't fade, and he is arguably as, you know, tops in that department as anyone who ever played. I think it is super important for the Sixers to find some, you know, it doesn't have to be one particular playmaker to get around Embiid and Maxey, but having LeBron's playmaking, I think, would be just huge. Like, he can make any pass in the book. He's great with the ball in his hands, kicking it out, getting it wherever it needs, or just making those quick decisions to keep the ball moving to where it has to go. And I think that even as his athleticism fades, I mean, the fact that he just shot 41% from three over a full season and played 70 games, I think means something. Like, you know, is that going to be the way he goes about playing the rest of his days? I don't know, but I think it's very helpful that he's shown those signs, and he's had those seasons before where he's shot at least above average. And then, you know, just having him in a pick and roll with Joel, I think would be huge. Like, he's obviously just, I agree with what you said, that Joel, with how he played this season, would be his best teammate ever. And we'll see, you know, how it's like for him to defer at least to him, and if not to both him and to Maxey. But like, having those guys to lean on, I think, can help him, you know, elongate the end of his career a little bit. Like, he still can be a top option on a good team, but like, having those guys, especially because they can both provide value off the ball, because Joel can help a lot defensively. I think, you know, it makes sense as to why he would want to spend the last of his days as a top 15 or so talent, really 10 when he turns it on. I think, you know, there's really not much thought needed. Like, it's LeBron James. It's old LeBron James, but it's still LeBron James. And he is probably going to be, if he does change teams, the best player to change teams this offseason. Like, if you're the Sixers and all it costs you is cap space, and even if it does cost you the 16th pick, you do have to go for it. It would be tough, like I mentioned earlier, building around making sure that Maxi's prime doesn't have any obstacles. If he does sign like a few years contract and then retires, I think it would be tougher to get a high level player back because of how the salary cap works. Like they wouldn't, whatever they do this offseason is going to kind of lock them in for the near future, because once they sign Maxi, they're going to be over the cap for pretty much, the rest of the way unless they clean house again in a huge way. So just having LeBron sign and then retire would be tough, but I think the chance that he gives the Sixers to go further in the playoffs would be more than worth it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And we've talked about Bronny's to go back to his son, his performance in the combine and his shooting and everything like that. He just shot 19 out of 25 in the shooting drill, which means nothing, but at the same time, you'd rather a guy shoot well than not shoot well in the shooting drill. So it's, I will say it's something of a sign of encouragement. But you mentioned that kind of short-term nature and that lack of, I don't want to say lack of optionality, but that kind of financial conundrum that you'll be in, after, post LeBron James there. And I think that's a situation that Philadelphia would roll the dice on, right? So, at that point, you have a pretty good chance at getting a ring within those next couple of years. Cap is expected to continue to go up. Joel Embiid is up for an extension, which I have no idea what the team's going to do with that. I think it's like 198 million over 3 years, which is just an insane number for an insane player, to be fair. But when you look at the financial future under this new CBA, yeah, it's probably gonna be tough. But they're going to definitely make sure that department is ready for any eventuality that could come through that. And if you end up being able to utilize exceptions and you sign guys to minimums, and you still have your draft picks, that's going to be the thing too, is that if you keep LeBron, or if you have LeBron, you still have those draft picks. So you're not necessarily going to be able to move them with a large salary, which, to your point, Sam, is a possibility, but you're going to at least have the picks that you can make. And so it's going to really be on the front office to actually hit on those draft picks if they do retain them in that situation that they're not able to trade them for other star players. So there's so many like possible wrinkles that could come from signing LeBron James. And it's kind of a really unique situation. I think you both kind of brought that up really well. But there's just so much unknown for the future. But the certainty is you're signing LeBron freaking James. And I think that's definitely an avenue that Daryl Morey's going to pursue. The last possibility that we're going to talk about today, and there's a lot more options. There's guys like Brandon Ingram. There's guys like Mikal Bridges, Lauri Markkanen, and we could talk all day, and another day we will, about how likely those moves potentially are. But the other guy who's been mentioned in excess with Philadelphia has been Jimmy Butler, right? It all started with Jimmy Butler's initial comments talking about how the Knicks would have been eliminated, the Celtics would have been eliminated, and kind of alluding to the concept of him playing for Philly in that, which were immensely overblown at the time. But Pat Riley certainly didn't help things by opening his big mouth and kind of fanning flames and my way or the highway and all that other great old head NBA stuff. But the short of the whole situation is, to not belabor an annoyingly long point already, Jimmy Butler has been connected through various just rumors, nothing more, to Philadelphia. He's a player who is unhappy with his current financial situation on his team, and that's something Philadelphia could remedy, right? So just the very simple concept of Philadelphia reacquiring Jimmy Butler. I love Jimmy. I think he's one of the coolest players in the league, even now. With that being said, and I might sound crazy, I'm not trying to trade for Jimmy Butler if I'm Philadelphia right now. And I'll get your guys' opinion on this, but for me, I want to not so much focus on the past mistakes of this franchise. I want to start making good making good decisions going forward, right? So the time to get Jimmy Butler was 5 years ago when they could have signed him. And he's still a heck of a player. He's still a heck of a winner, and I think he could still contribute. And if you can get it done for 2 firsts, sure. Why the hell not? It's not the world we live in. You're not looking at, there's already been reports out of Miami as they try to set the starting asking price of 3 first rounders and 3 first round pick swaps. And that's an insane price for Jimmy Butler, if you ask me. So I love the guy. I wish him well. I don't see it happening in Philadelphia. Sam, Jimmy Butler, are you trying to revisit that? Are you trying to leave well enough alone? Where do you stand on the Jimmy Butler debate?
Yeah, I don't think it's time for a Jimmy reunion in Philly, if only because of, like you mentioned, the way that it has to happen. Like, I think there is a lot of concern on the court with how he would fit, particularly with Joel. Obviously, they're close. They've maintained a good relationship through the years, but unless Jimmy's going to become a much more willing and better 3-point shooter, it's going to be a clunky fit. And this is something that Daryl mentioned as not one of his priorities, but like something that is important to him in some way, being good without Joel. Like the fact that the Sixers were so bad without Joel this season, cost them a lot. And that's something that Daryl mentioned is something that he needs to do. He could have done a better job at and sounded like he wants to do. Having Jimmy is not going to change that. Like we've talked, all the guys we talked about have had injury problems, but Jimmy being the worst on court fit, even though he would be nice to have on defense with whatever he has left, like I just think it's a very clunky fit on top of bringing in a big contract using a lot of draft capital that the Heat are not going to give him up easily. It's going to take a lot. And, with any concerns, look at Paul George, like any concerns you have about him coming in, at least the Sixers would still have the draft picks and stuff to use in other trades to support the roster around him. For them to trade for Jimmy would pretty much just be a big 3 of stars, Paul and Ricky, I guess, if they're still there, and a bunch of minimum guys because they're not going to have as much space and they're not going to have as much to trade to get other, pieces in. So I think that with Jimmy, the Sixers would be better, but not so much. Again, to throw it back to something that Daryl had mentioned, under this new CBA, which is more punitive to the highest spenders, you have to make really good decisions and ask, you don't ask, is this player helpful? Is this player helpful at this price, and what it means in terms of other ramifications? And through that lens, which I think is the right lens to look through, I don't think it's right for the Sixers to trade for Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean, so he's going to be 35 come the start of next season. I think that you relating it back to Daryl Morey's comments is very apt because Morey was very focused on not just making a move, right? So the kind of like perceived subtweet of the whole conversation that he had with us was that they're not looking to redo the Tobias Harris signing, for instance, right? And so, you think on the one hand, like, oh, well, going Jimmy, that's like the opposite of re-signing Tobias Harris. Well, it's not necessarily, because you're looking at overcommitting yourself financially for a player who's not necessarily worth that at that time in that situation, exactly as you said. So, that's, again, you and I are on the same page there. Justin, Jimmy Butler obviously makes the Sixers better. You're going to have to extend him if and when the Sixers do trade for him. Are you feeling that, or are you really just kind of looking at the next guy up?
Yeah, no, I'm not feeling it. Like Sam mentioned, clunky on court fit. Like Jimmy doesn't shoot threes. Like to maximize and max his driving lanes, you need a guy who will at least attempt them, right? high volume or at least attempt them or a good 3-point shooter. Not only, in my opinion, Jimmy's not a good 3-point shooter. He doesn't take them. Like, I remember him coming here and he just like basically hated the offense of how Brett Brown had like this Spurs like free flowing offense. And he like didn't shoot threes for like the first couple months he was here unless he was like super wide open. But it was just like, that's not a part of his game. And I just feel like on court fit, just not right now. And it's just 5 years too late. Like back then, 5 years ago, whatever, Sixers chose Ben over Jimmy. And we have to live with it as fans. We can figure out what could have happened, if Jimmy was here, but he wasn't. He went on a couple finals runs. He didn't win the championship. Sixers haven't won the championship. Just leave that door closed. Paying Jimmy more money for him to be just as injured all the time. And then, okay, yeah, you get playoff Jimmy, but then sometimes you get playoff Jimmy where he doesn't do anything. Like, we forget about those times. Like, we forget about those times where they got swept by the Milwaukee Bucks in the first round right after the finals appearance. Like, Brent Forbes had a better playoff series than Jimmy Butler. So, like, I'm just saying, like, I'm not taking away from the guy's mystique or whatever the case may be. Like, Jimmy is good, but trading 3 first-round picks and 3 pick swaps, nah, I'm good. I'll take my chances with Paul George, LeBron James, Harrison Barnes, whoever else. But I just feel like it's just not the right fit. It's not the right time, and not for that price.
Yeah, I got to pause from this action for a moment. And I do agree with you, Justin. Obviously, Sam and I were saying similar things, so we're all in agreement on Jimmy. But I got to take a minute here. Jonathan Wasserman talking about Devin Carter with a 42-inch max vert tying Reed Shepherd for the highest at the combine. And then he goes right out and he sets a combine record with the fastest 3/4 court sprint time of all time. The fastest. This is an offseason, like this is a trade and free agency podcast, for this episode. I know we're not talking draft yet. I really want to get into it, even though the Sixers are not keeping that pick 16. Holy shit, do I want Devin Carter, man. I cannot tell you enough. I've been drooling over this guy for a long time already, and I'm pissed that they're going to trade this pick and they're not going to draft him. Sam, I know you love the guy too. Do you have any thoughts on what I just said about Devin Carter?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a preview for when we talk about the draft when it's closer. But yeah, that's a guy that I think is going to benefit a lot from this pre-draft process, especially as teams go back and look at the tape and what he can do. I wouldn't be surprised if, a team goes up and reaches on him just because of, the athleticism that we're seeing at the combine right now. I think he would be great on the Sixers. And, although it would be, an interesting fit to see them draft a guard or another big, obviously the fit on the wing is like apparent. But if they do go guard, he's definitely one of the ones that they should get at 16.
Yeah, and he's got fine size at 6'3". I'm fine with that. And man, and I'm telling you, I got DeJounte Murray vibes about him. I'm really feeling this guy as a prospect, and I'm getting more and more angry just thinking about the fact that he will not be here because the Sixers are going to trade that 16th pick. Man, what a way to end a free agency and trade pod, but talking about the draft. But that's the thing, is that there's a lot of optionality that you to use the Howie word this offseason. So we'll see what happens. The Wizards are apparently trying to get a 3rd first-round pick. So maybe 16 ends up going to Washington and Denny Avdia comes to Philadelphia. I wouldn't hate that either.
If it does.
Don't say Kuzma. Don't say Kuzma.
No, Denny Avdia or Corey Kispert. Good. One of those two, I think, would make that trade very nicely for Philly.
Yeah, I would want more if it's Corey Kispert, but I like Kispert too. So if you're going to get him and maybe like future draft compensation as well, absolutely, for sure. I love Kispert. I love Denny Avdia. Definitely, I think that's the kind of move that you can't overlook from Daryl this offseason as well, is that they're not necessarily if they move 16, they're not necessarily going to move it in a huge package, as that we talked about the 5 first-round picks they can trade. They might move it into a future pick. they might move it for a player this year. You don't quite know. So definitely very interesting. There's going to be a lot going forward that we're going to have to monitor on this team. We will be back to talk more Sixers offseason targets. Again, guys like Mikal Bridges, guys like Brandon Ingram, Donovan Mitchell may come up at some point. You never know. Just a lot to still talk about this offseason. But thank you so much for watching and listening for now. Thank you to Sam, Justin, of course, for working hard as always on this podcast. And, hopefully we brought a little bit of good conversation around the Philadelphia 76ers to you folks. But stick around, look out for the next episode to drop, and let us know in the comments what players you would like us to talk about on that next episode, because there's a lot to choose from, and we could definitely use your help. So definitely stick around. For now, I've been Zach with Sam and Justin. This has been Still Processing, a 76ers podcast.